Thank you, Guya, for okay. Okay. Yes, continue. So thank you again, Zachariah Mampilly, for being with us. Zachariah is a Marxe Endowed Chair of International Affairs at the Marxe School of Public and International Affairs, City University of New York. He has published in numerous books as author, co-editor, including Rebel Rulers, Insurgent Governance and Civilian Life During War, a very influential book for me because I'm interested in popular protest, is the book that Zachariah wrote with Adam Branch, Africa Uprising, Popular Protest and Political Change, which popularized the term third wave of popular protests in Africa. He is also the co-editor of Rebel Governance in Civil Wars and Peacemaking from Practice to Theory. So Zachariah will now have between 20 to 40 minutes to deliver his presentation. And after that, we will have a Q&A, some Q&A time, and all of you are, of course, welcome to submit questions, just raising your hands in the end of Zachariah's presentation, or just writing your question in the chat. I guess this is how it works, but maybe Tiago and I don't know whether you want to add further details to this.
Let's see, we see also many people we still have in the room in the Q&A sessions, and if we are not so many, I know that some colleagues should leave after the talk because they have classes, etc. If you are not so many, we can also discuss each other. We see, okay?
Okay.
As you prefer, you're the chair.
Yes, so Zachariah will decide how all this will go, and I want to thank you all for being here. And now I give the floor to Zachariah for the following minutes. Thank you so much once again.
Thank you, Idalina, for the very generous introduction, and thank you to Gia and Tiago for organizing the opportunity to share some research with all of you. I'm very excited to be here. I wish I could be in Lisbon with all of you in person, but hopefully someday that may happen. I am going to share my screen right now to show you a presentation that I just put together this morning that looks at some of my ongoing research. I thought I would provide a little bit of context in terms of the book that Idalina mentioned, Africa Uprising, that I co-wrote with Adam Branch. But I really want to focus today my comments on sort of an ongoing project that comes out of that book, where I'm really trying to center the question of how do Africa's rural areas fit into this ongoing protest wave, and what does it say about the state of African politics more generally? So let me go ahead and share this screen, and I will try to keep this fairly informal. I certainly welcome your comments and feedbacks, because this is a project that is very early in its gestation. I haven't been able to get as much work done over the past year, as I'm sure is the same for all of you. But I think I'm moving towards some of the kind of theoretical and conceptual terrain that I want to explore in this project. And I certainly welcome any sort of feedback or critiques in terms of the way I'm trying to conceptualize this. Okay, so let me go ahead and share this. Okay. So as I mentioned, this is a project that is coming out of a book that I co-wrote in 2015 with Adam Branch that really wanted to look at the question of what's going on in terms of popular movements in Africa today. And I think that one of the limitations that we had in the book, this is probably familiar to most of you, is that those of us who study social movements and radical politics in general tend to focus predominantly on the urban space. There's a strong theoretical reason why this is so. Much of it relates back to kind of the origins of social movement studies within kind of a Marxist tradition that really centered the agency of urban workers as being kind of the central actor within social movements generally. And I think part of my discomfort with that framing is that, obviously Africa remains a predominantly rural continent, like much of the global South. and that fundamentally, when we adopt such a frame to understand the question of popular movements, we tend to ignore many different types of protests that unfolds in rural spaces. And so rather than saying this is a book about rural protests, I'm more interested in understanding how the rural fits into questions of national and even continental protest in Africa and beyond. So a few questions that I think relate both to the first project, Africa Uprising, and then the current project that I'm working on now. As Idalina mentioned, we coined the phrase the third wave of African protest to sort of speak to what we see as this huge upsurge of protest that has been unfolding across Africa since around the mid-2000s. And I think there are these sort of common structural factors that have shaped Africa's incorporation into global capitalism that are very germane for understanding what's been happening. And I think an important part of what I'm trying to do here is to understand how these economic processes have extended into African rural areas as well. That I think is an important part of how I want to distinguish this from sort of some of the historical protest waves that have happened. Obviously, if this is the third wave, then we are speaking of a first and second wave as well. And one of the core tasks we set out to do in the Africa Uprising book is to try to trace the lineage of an African protest tradition by looking back historically to the early part of the 20th century, where we first start to see the emergence of popular movements on the African continent. But then also what is distinctive about the current wave. So I think one of the tendencies that you observe if you study African protests is that despite the fact that Africa seems to be a site in which popular movements, social movements, violent movements are far more prevalent than other regions of the world, we often understand African social movements with theoretical frames that are developed in other contexts, especially with theoretical frames developed to study social movements in the global north. And I think there are advantages to doing that, but also huge disadvantages that don't take seriously Africa's long history of social movement organizing that can inform how we understand what is distinctive about African protests today. And then very centrally in terms of what I'm working on currently, what role does the rural play in African uprisings, right? I think this is something that has become ever more prominent, and I'll show you some case studies a little bit later. But if we look at, say, the Sudanese Uprising of 2019, we see very clearly that that was an uprising that began in more rural parts of the continent. If we talk about other places in Africa like Congo, we can see that a lot of the most dynamic energy is not taking place in the capital cities, but in more peripheral parts of the country, especially in the rural areas. And so the question for me is, is this random? Is this opportunistic? Or is there something distinctive about rural life in Africa today that helps explain why it is that we see so many of these movements emerging in spaces that we historically have not expected them to emerge? Just to give you some context here, I think, because this is important in terms of the larger project of trying to ground African resistance within a longer African history. The first wave of protests that we were interested in the book were the so-called anti-colonial protests of the 1940s to the 1960s. These were in line with anti-colonial protests that were emerging around the world at this time, especially in the South Asian context, with the Indian independence movement, and very quickly that spread to many other parts of the colonial world, including Africa. And so we see here, the upsurge of protest movements led by figures like Kwame Nkrumah, who are very successful in pushing a rapid decolonization of the African continent. So between 1956, when Sudan gets its independence, and 1963, the vast majority of African countries become independent during this period. There are exceptions. Obviously, the Portuguese colonies and Southern Africa remain under the control of imperial powers, but the vast majority of Africa becomes formally independent during this period. But it's not a story of unencumbered success. It is a period in which you have a broader failure of the African political elite who really embrace various forms of militarized nationalism. And so even as these protests lead to independence, they do not lead to democratization. Right? Instead, what you see are some of the same figures who are associated with the protest wave, essentially becoming these autocratic figures in the post-independence dispensation. And they work very actively to subdue the various social forces that were central to their success during the anti-colonial struggles. This is reflected in the empirical data. I won't say too much about here, but if you look at this period of 1960s all the way to the 1990s, very few African societies look anything like democracies. And I think part of what I am interested in here is locating this failure of African societies to democratize, not in any sort of innate failing or in any innate lack of love for democracy amongst Africans, as it is sometimes framed in the West, but rather about the types of political processes that unfold in this transition from a social movement to a political party. Right? And so one of the big concerns we have in the book, and I think continues to animate my work now, is why have social movements replaced the political party as the primary vehicle for political transformation in the African context today? And I think part of that has to go back to this period to look at how social movements were shoveled into the format of a political party in the post-independence period. Right? Just to give you a sense of what this looked like, this is Kwame Nkrumah. This is important because I think one of the important aspects about how we think about Nkrumah, a lot of our histories of independence struggles in Africa and elsewhere tend to center on charismatic individuals, usually men, who are at the forefront of explicit political parties. And I think that this narrative, as we pointed out in the book, is problematic for a number of reasons, but mainly because it tends to exclude the participation of ordinary Africans in these types of popular struggles. And so here you can see an image of Nkrumah in Accra, surrounded by what were referred to as the veranda boys. These were young men, mostly recent rural to urban migrants who arrived in Accra under the colonial regime, who were at the forefront of the nationalist movement in Ghana. Right? And so much of the project of Nkrumah was really to discipline these individuals into the larger structure of the CPP, the Convention People's Party, which was the political party that he used as a vehicle to become Ghana's first post-independence leader. Right? But my interest here, and I think in the book as well, was, well, what about the rest of these people? Right? What about all of these young men who were really viewed by the British as a threat following a series of riots in colonial terminology that upset the British rulers and gave an opportunity to Kwame Nkrumah to position himself at the forefront of the independence movement within this very hierarchical structure where the CPP and Nkrumah himself were positioned at the apex of the larger movement. Rather than it being thought of as a more sort of horizontal representation of a diverse set of social forces that came together to challenge colonial domination. I'll come back to this point in a minute, but I think that the basic gist of it here is trying to trace this transition of social movements into political parties that occurs during this period. If we look ahead and jump to the second major wave of popular uprisings in Africa, we're now into the 1980s and 1990s. Coinciding with the wave of popular protests globally that were triggered by the end of the Cold War and the collapse of the Soviet Union. These, again, were very successful in one sense. They led to the formal democratization of the continent. You see here, if you look at various indicators of democracy, a huge increase from less than 3 democracies prior to the 1990s to over 20 democracies. Again, based on the criteria that these indicators use, and an additional 20 African countries holding regular elections, right? So they are successful in a formal sense, right? But I think ever since 2007, at least according to Freedom House, represented the high point of African democratization, right? Since then, there's been a lot of discussion around a perceived backsliding of African democracy. There's a perception that this is a global phenomenon. And I'm really interested in this because it forces us to try to understand the nature of democracy that came into being as a result of these protest movements in the 1980s and 1990s. Right? Is it the case that Africa is backsliding because Africans themselves have lost faith in democracy to bring about the types of transformative changes that they are calling for? Or is there something else going on? And my general sense is that, that if we look at the indicators such as Afrobarometer, we continue to see overwhelming support amongst Africans, at least in those countries that Afrobarometer is able to survey, for democracy, right? And a continued rejection of the big man model of rule that African elites often suggest is the reason why they're so willing to manipulate elections or call off elections altogether. In other words, the faith in democracy is as strong as ever, even as the institutions of democracy seem to be diminishing. Right? And what does that say about the particular juncture we find ourselves in the African context today. So let me just point out a couple observations, and I'll move to my ongoing research based, about how I perceive the first two protest waves. Right. Undoubtedly they were significant in terms of bringing about major political transitions on the African continent. The first wave really is responsible for producing independence. The second wave, as I just discussed, was very successful in sort of bringing about elections. But there were little change in the broader economic conditions that have unfolded in Africa. So what's really interesting about the second wave of protest in particular is that even where new leaders come to power, the economic agendas that these leaders are advancing is fundamentally the same. Right? This, I think, is an unappreciated point. If we look at the period prior to the 1980s, we can see that Africa actually had, African political elites actually had a fairly diverse set of ideologies that motivated their oppositional politics. Right? I think the most prominent example of this is something like the African National Congress in South Africa. There's a tendency sometimes to put South Africa outside of these broader trends, but if we think about South Africa as an African state, as I think it should be thought, the anti-apartheid struggle of the 1980s is coinciding with these pro-democracy struggles elsewhere on the continent, right? And what's really interesting about the ANC is that the ANC was a political party that formally aligned itself with a very explicit economically left agenda, right? Even today, the ANC is still a member of the Socialist International. And obviously many ANC leaders had overt ties to the Communist Party. Right. So why is it that in the early 1990s, when the ANC finally comes to power, that the type of economic policies that they advance are fundamentally the same as those of African governments around the continent and of their sort of apartheid opponents? And I think here is where we have to again shift our lens from the national context to look at the larger global context that is imposing these sort of neoliberal policies upon African economies, so that we end up in a position, and it's not just South Africa, right? It's across the continent, Tanzania and other places that I've examined, where opposition leaders are on one side being invited into participating in these highly manipulated elections. So that is a form of democratization that is unfolding, at least in a formal sense, but on the condition that they abandon any sort of agenda for economic transformation, right? And so across Africa in the 1990s and into the 2000s, even as we see opposition leaders actually being able to come to power, either through elections or some other means, that fundamentally we do not see any shift in the longer economic trajectory that Africa has been moving towards, which is a fundamental embrace of a neoliberal logic of free markets, foreign direct investment, and so on. And I think that's a hugely important contextual factor that is shaping the current wave of protest. And that's what I mean by the disciplining of opposition parties by global capitalism. In other words, that the only way that opposition figures are allowed to participate in the type of formalized democracy that is coming into being during this period is by embracing a set of neoliberal economic policies as a precondition for participation. Right? This is something that was observed by African commentators during this period itself in the 1990s. I spent some time at the University of Dar es Salaam at this period. Figures like Issa Shivji were critiquing the ways in which Tanzania's economy was democratizing by embracing neoliberal economic policies. I think most evocatively, Thandika Mkandawire, who was a great Malawian economist, coined the phrase "choiceless democracy." Right, basically to speak to the kind of collapsing of political imaginaries that occurs during this transition to democracy in Africa, especially on the economic front. Right, so regardless of their background, whether these figures are coming out of explicitly communist backgrounds or more socialist backgrounds, once in power, once even allowed to contest for power, they start to espouse a common economic agenda of free trade, open markets, and privatization. Right. And again, this is really striking because Tanzania is a country that prior to this period was a one-party state, but was also overtly aligned with the communist bloc. Right, it was very much influenced by the Soviet Union, but also the Chinese model in particular. And during this period, we see a movement away from that, even by the ruling party, towards an embrace of neoliberal economics. That brings us to the third wave, and here's where I'll really focus on the question of the rural. But as I mentioned, this is a set of protests that I think have been unfolding since around the mid-2000s and have been continuing into the present period. We wrote about a lot of the first 10 years of this wave in Africa's uprising, and it was a question I received a lot when we were first presenting the results from that book was, do you think that this protest wave will continue? And my response always was, well, until the structural conditions that are producing the wave change, I don't see why the protests themselves would stop. And I think the past 5 years have certainly borne out that prediction in the sense that we see protests continuing in many parts of Africa into the current period, right, into 2021. This is just some empirical data that we were able to draw. This is perhaps the largest protest wave that has unfolded in Africa. Of the 3 that we document. In the book, we documented over 40 African countries experiencing some form of popular uprising. Many of these are related to specific electoral or economic crises, but one of the main theoretical arguments we wanted to put forth in the book is to understand protests as fundamentally contingent actions, right? So that even as protests may start with concerns over elections or, say, an increase in fuel prices or food, that they can then morph into these much larger protests that call for the collapse of the regime itself. And we've seen this pattern repeat itself over and over. Right. I think this is part of what makes it difficult for how we understand it. We tend to get stuck in this debate about whether or not these are election protests or economic protests, rather than, say, larger protests around the nature of the social and political regime that exists in African countries. And our response to that has always been, well, regardless of how they start, what is significant about them is that they can often transform into these much larger protests that actually call for these much more transformative agendas. But this is also the reason I think that they are often dismissed, right? We tend not to understand their political salience by reducing their purpose to simply a protest around elections or simply a protest around fuel prices, right? And then, of course, the question of violence often raises its head, where many of these protests don't follow the standard civil society model of social movement action put forth in the West, right? And they are often much more entangled with question of violence. Some of the protesters may use violence themselves. They are often met by tremendous violence from the state. And this allows states, and I would suggest the international community as well, to dismiss them as riots. Right. And all of this, I think, is driven by a larger bias against how we understand radical politics, even amongst people on the left globally, when it comes to Africa. There's a sense in which Africa is understood as being fundamentally too rural, too poor, or too ethnic for popular protests to exist. Right? And so there's this huge space, even amongst the left, that largely views Africa as outside of larger conversations around global protests in ways that I think are very problematic, and we can come back to this. All right, just to sketch out some of the dynamics that I'm interested in the particular context of rural radicalism in Africa. These are, I think, statistics that are fairly well known to most people, but I think are pretty important. Africa is the youngest continent in the world by far. It is also the fastest growing continent in the world. The vast majority of Africans are young people. The average age of an African is 20 years old. The average age of an African leader is 63 years old. So the age gap in Africa is larger than anywhere else in the world, 43 years. Just to give you some point of reference, the United States just elected the oldest president in American history, Joe Biden, who is 78 years old. The median age for an American is something like 41. So Biden actually represents the average age gap between an African and his or her ruler, and would not be an outlier by any measure in the African context. Right? Africa is urbanizing very rapidly. It's the fastest pace of urbanization in the world. Yet still 60% of the population lives in rural areas. And so even as it is going through this massive transformation as a result of these dynamics, we still see that the majority of Africans live in rural spaces. As I think I was kind of hinting at when discussing the second wave, as a result of the sort of formal opening of African politics to opposition parties. We have seen a huge increase in the number of elections that are being held, but there is an increasing cynicism about the nature and quality of these elections, that in fact they have proven to be quite compatible with authoritarianism. And so whether we're looking at places like Uganda, or many other parts of the continent, what we have seen is that autocrats in the African context have no problem holding regular elections, allowing opposition parties to exist, and yet quite openly and blatantly manipulating the outcomes of those elections. Right. And so there's a need now to think about what democratization means beyond elections, because there's no reason to presume that simply holding elections is placing these countries on an inevitable trajectory towards any sort of substantive understanding of what democracy means. Right. Instead, what we're able to observe is that many African leaders are quite willing to preside over illiberal democratic regimes, ones that don't have much respect for basic rights that we would associate with democracy, especially the right to free speech and right to free assembly that is necessary for social movements to function. Right? There's also been a huge increase in the rise of conservative African nationalism. I think this is, again, not unique to the African context, but it's something that is often not commented on adequately by observers outside of the continent. There are many ways, and I'll come back to this point in a minute, in which African leaders have been sort of touting their sort of anti-colonial qualifications, even as they use that as a mechanism to suppress pro-democracy movements. And fundamentally, I think if you look back on the past 2 decades, even as we've seen a massive increase in formal democratic institutions, there has been little substantive change. Right? To come to some of the economic factors, which I think are hugely important, Africa has been growing very rapidly since at least 1995. The majority of African countries have had growth rates above 3%, in some cases 10, 12% even. Almost all of this is driven by the kind of ongoing commodity boom. It's only continuing going forward. A huge part of this, of course, is related to the rise of Asian economies. Asia is now the largest trading partner with Africa compared to its historic trading partners of the United States or the European Union. Asia now buys more African goods and exports more goods to Africa than any other region. And here, when I say Asia, I mean Asia specifically. Obviously, China is kind of like the 800-pound gorilla in the room, or in the region, as it were. But other Asian countries, whether we're talking about India, Malaysia, Turkey, the Gulf countries in particular, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, have all become major players in the African space. And again, in ways that I don't think we've adequately understood in terms of how they impact domestic political factors. One of the key things I think that is very important here is what all of this foreign direct investment is doing in the African context. So one of the holy grails of the international financial institutions is that if you want to bring about development, you must attract foreign direct investment, which will trigger a process of industrialization and thereby provide employment opportunities to ordinary citizens who can then enter the working class by working, say, in a factory. Right? This model has not really held in the African context. In some parts of Africa, like Kenya, we actually have a lower share of workers employed in the industrial sector today than we did in the 1980s. Right? And economists have actually coined a term for this, which is de-industrialization. So even as Africa has benefited from all this FDI, it hasn't actually led to the pathways out of poverty that advocates at the international financial institutions promised. Right? And we see this again reflected in the aggregate data. There's been a massive spike in inequality across the continent. Right? Almost all of the gains that have been produced by this growth in Africa has been captured by very narrow elites. Africa, which at one point was a relatively economically homogeneous space, meaning there weren't huge inequalities in wealth across the continent, has now become the continent with the largest number of highly unequal countries in the world. This is data that I just looked at using the World Bank. 9 of the 12 most unequal countries by Gini coefficient are based in Africa. Importantly, this includes very, very rich countries like South Africa. Everybody knows that South Africa is one of the most unequal societies in the world. But it also includes some of the poorest countries in Africa. So the Central African Republic is also one of the 9 most unequal countries in the world. Right? So this dynamic where inequality is spiking across the continent is not unique to one set of African countries, but in fact seems to be a common pattern. And again, to sum up, I think that what we can say, and this is not my words, this is a phrase I took from a World Bank study of Nigeria, which is the richest African country, the largest GDP in the world, in the continent. But as almost all of that wealth has been captured by a very narrow set of Nigerian elite, right? So Nigeria is both the richest African country, as well as the country in the world with the highest number of people living in absolute poverty. Okay. And how do we explain such a divergent set of outcomes? Well, it only makes sense if you think about almost all of those gains being captured by these narrow economic elites. Okay, so to come to what the current project is trying to do in terms of its sort of theoretical orientation, and then I'll just share a few case studies that I've been looking at. I think one of the consistent tendencies that is prevalent in literature on African politics is that rural spaces are imagined as atavistic, anti-development, and anti-national. Right? The rural is really imagined as a space governed by the logic of ethnicity or tribe. Right? And that fundamentally it has at its core a very kind of conservative politics. Right? And I think what the rise of rural radicalism seems to be demonstrating is that this assumption may no longer hold if it ever did. And I think a big part of that has to go back to a long tradition in African politics research, which has really critically examined the role of traditional authorities and the ways going back to the colonial period in which traditional authorities were instrumentalized by national elites or colonial elites into these patron-client relationships where traditional authorities were brought into these highly paternalistic arrangements with elites in the national capitals, through which they were empowered to manage through coercion rural populations. Right? And one of the core tenets, I think, of the kind of critical perspective around the potential of African rural areas to be at the forefront of radical politics is the assumption that these traditional bonds are as strong today as they were during the colonial period. Right? Because post-independence regimes did so little to try to challenge the dominance of traditional authorities over the rural spaces. And so, there is a tradition in African politics scholarship, figures like Mamdani in particular, who have spent a lot of time calling for African states to detribalize the rural areas, right? And to point to examples like Uganda in the early days of the NRM or Tanzania under Nyerere, where very few African governments actually worked to try to undercut the power of the traditional authority over rural life. And I think what I'm seeing now, and I'll talk about this in a minute, is that it's actually not the national governments that are engaged in this process of detribalizing the rural areas, but rather these larger structural forces that seem to be doing that work for them. So as the rural areas become a site of increased foreign direct investment, this is leading to very transformative changes in rural relationships to land in particular, which is the source of power for traditional authorities that is undercutting their influence over rural youth. Okay, and I'll say more about this in a minute, but the big piece of this that I think is important is that there is a fundamental shift in labor identities in the rural spaces. So historically, we've understood African rural areas as the space of the peasant, right? The ethnically defined peasant in particular, whose lives were governed by their attachment to a traditional land, which was mediated by the traditional chief. What we have seen, right, as a result of all the foreign direct investment that is coming in, is that these relationships are being fundamentally undercut. Right? To give a concrete example, in Sudan, there's been a massive influx of money coming in from the Gulf countries that is directed towards rural areas, to these massive agricultural schemes that have led to the massive displacement of rural populations. Right? And it has provided rural youth in particular new employment possibilities within these multinational agricultural enterprises in ways that undercut the authority of the chief, which historically had the right to determine who had access to the land. Right? What has shifted as a result of these global economic changes is that the traditional authority is increasingly being displaced, and rural populations now have additional opportunities through which they can make a living. Right? I don't want to romanticize these new opportunities. I think there's a lot of problems with them, and I'll talk about that. But the basic point is that contra decades of chiefly dominance over rural spaces, we are now seeing a force, specifically economic investment, which is powerful enough to start to undercut some of those ties. So the goal of the book, this project that I'm working on, whatever it becomes, is really to try to understand, varying forms of rural radicalism that are emerging and how they map onto some of these national political questions that I've been highlighting. So first, I think there is the reality that rural questions are increasingly becoming national questions. So again, previously there was a tendency to assume that rural spaces were parochial, tribal, traditional, that they were only concerned with ethnic issues that affected specific communities, right? This is a tendency that many governments in Africa are trying to use to discredit rural protests. If we look at Ethiopia, we see very clear examples where, protests in Oromo will be characterized as Oromo protests, or protests in Tigray will be characterized as Tigray protests, even as the actors on the ground are saying we are actually critiquing the entire structure of the Ethiopian state itself, right? And so what we're increasingly seeing, whether we're talking about Ethiopia or Sudan or other places, are that questions that are emerging out of the rural areas, right, are speaking to these larger national issues and no longer can be dismissed as merely reflecting the interests of specific ethnic communities. Right? Examples of this, I think, are kind of rural movements around climate change. I've already talked about kind of the role of foreign direct investment and how that is transforming rural spaces and leading to an upsurge of activism. There's some really interesting work by Nisreen El-Amin on Sudanese rural radicalism that I think folks might be interested in. Militarization, some of you may have heard about the recent conflict between Ethiopia and Sudan around the border areas and how those kind of conflicts can be resolved. There's a tendency to assume that the only solution is a massive militarized border between these two spaces. But again, rural communities are pushing back against these kind of logics. This is similar to patterns that are unfolding across the Sahel, where the global war on terror is being used as a justification for shutting down the relatively porous borders that have characterized African politics pretty much forever. And so increasingly what we're seeing are debates that are emerging out of rural spaces that are becoming nationalized, right? Becoming a core of what's driving politics at the national level. So this is the first way that I think the rural is mapping onto the urban. The second is more literal, and I think, by and large, when we talk about urbanization in the African context, there is an assumption that these are one-way processes, people shedding their traditional way of life to move to the modern way of life in the urban spaces. And I think, this is actually empirically not true. There are a few exceptions to this. Sam Moyo has always sort of advocated for a more nuanced understanding of African internal migration patterns, right? We tend to assume that, Africans move from the rural areas to the capital cities, and then from the capital cities out of the country altogether, and ideally out of the continent altogether. This is increasingly less true, right? We see all sorts of internal migration in Africa between African countries, right? Which dwarfs, say, the African migration to Europe. And importantly, we see people moving from urban spaces back to rural areas. So even as rural people continue to move into urban spaces, it's not a one-way migration. It's instead circular migration. And this inevitably brings the rural into the urban, but also the urban into the rural in ways that I think have not been adequately appreciated, right? And that's an important kind of concern. And then finally, the question of the rural in the urban. And this goes back to the book on Africa Uprising that we wrote in 2015. One of our major theoretical arguments in that book is that we needed to move away from our focus on formalized civil society, right? By which we meant NGOs, labor unions, student organizations that have historically been at the center of analyses of African popular politics. Instead, what we tried to do in that book was to shed light on what we referred to as political society. These were essentially people who had been marginalized by economic or political status in the urban spaces, people who live in slums, who live in shanty towns, who are not protesting using a language of rights, but who are instead making more radical calls for transformation, especially around economic issues. They don't have much faith in a kind of liberal framing around human rights and civil society, but instead are more comfortable challenging the dominance of the state with violence and other sort of subversive tactics, right? And as a result of that, have often been excluded from analyses of social movements. And our entire project with that book was to try to focus on these forms of what we refer to as political society protests, building on Partha Chatterjee's conceptualization of political society. One of the important points that I don't think we explored adequately in our discussion in the book was what is the demographic makeup of political society, right? And importantly, I think many of the people who live in such spaces and participate in such forms of political action are actually drawn from these recent rural to urban migrants, right? So when people are coming, into Khartoum or into Kampala or whatever African capital we're talking about, and moving into slums or shanty towns or whatever you want to, these informal settlements that have proliferated around African cities, we have to acknowledge that they often have very strong ties to rural communities, right? I have a colleague, Sam Opondo, who's been doing some very interesting work on some of these questions, and he was telling me about how in African slums, you actually have efforts to replicate traditional authorities, right? Because these informal settlements lack any sort of structured political arrangement, and so they are bringing in to the urban spaces these types of traditional authority structures. Right? And obviously, in that transition from rural to urban, they are being transformed themselves. So it's not to say that they are simply adopting rural modes of life into the urban spaces, but they're creating something new altogether. Right? And that is something that I'm really interested in exploring further. All right, so let me just wrap up here with a few examples, because I think it's always useful to talk about some concrete cases. This was the first case that I actually started to look at this in Tanzania. And I did this research as part of the Africa Uprising book. Then ultimately we decided not to include this because it was too far apart from our theoretical organization. But these were a series of protests that broke out in the southern part of the country around a gas pipeline that was being built from Mtwara to Dar es Salaam by the Chinese. And this led to a very interesting set of protests in a place called Machuja Park, which means Martyrs Park or Heroes Park, where something like 15,000 people from villages came to Mtwara, which is the capital of this very rural part of Tanzania, to protest what they perceived as the problematic construction of this pipeline. They were met with very strong government repression. Show you some images that I took of the aftermath of these protests. Basically the government sent the military in to respond to nonviolent rural protests and destroyed a number of structures in the village center. Here you can see some of the graffiti that was put on some of these abandoned buildings. Gesi Kwanza, it just means, Gesi is gas, right? And basically what they were calling for is that the gas be, the revenues from the gas that is being piped out of Mtwara actually be dedicated to develop Mtwara in the first place. Mtwara historically has been one of the poorest and most marginalized parts of Tanzania. And people in Mtwara felt that the pipeline was a part of this longer history where Mtwara's interests were being sacrificed for the national good. Right? What was really striking about these protests is how little sympathy they generated outside of the region. The president at the time, Zachariah Mampilly, denounced the protesters as anti-national. Right? The media largely joined in portraying people in Mtwara as backward, as anti-development, as selfish, and there was a very strong narrative that kind of delegitimated these protests as being kind of the actions of these uneducated, backward, rural dwellers in ways that completely, were antagonistic towards the actual politics that these protesters were trying to put forward. If we go to Sudan, I think this is a really interesting case as well. Sudan had a series of protests in 2012, 2013 that coincided with the Arab Spring, where they were largely repressed by the regime of Omar al-Bashir. But then in 2018, a new movement emerged, first in a town called Atbara, and then spread through a lot of the smaller towns and rural places in Sudan before it eventually arrived in the capital of Khartoum. And so this picture first is from the earlier protests in 2012 and 2013. A movement called Grifna, which was concentrated amongst Sudanese students. Very interesting, very creative protests that unfolded over a 2-year period, but ultimately were fundamentally unsuccessful in having any larger impact on the Bashir regime. Right? in 2018, the protests were very different. And you can see this not only in terms of the presence of women and ordinary people at the forefront of these protests, but also people from the peripheral parts of Sudan, right, who were at the very center of these protests. And so one of the interesting dynamics was the way in which Darfuris, right, actually shipped in large numbers of people on buses to participate in the sit-ins that occurred in Khartoum prior to the collapse of the Bashir regime. Right? And here is just one photo of Darfuris who were drawing very explicit connections between the kind of violence meted out in Darfur to the struggle for a new Sudan in Khartoum. Right, and they actually set up these education sites where people in Khartoum, who by and large were completely ignorant of what unfolded in Darfur, could learn about the kind of violence and marginalization that people in Darfur had faced throughout the Bashir regime. Right? If you look at sort of interviews with activists during this period, one of the slogans that emerged as a result of the protest movement was "We are all Darfur." Right? And here's just one quote from a Sudanese activist who participated around how their own conception of themselves as Sudanese was fundamentally transformed by the participation of rural populations in these protests. Right? There was a strong foregrounding of the racism inherent in the form of Sudanese nationalism that had been championed by the Bashir regime. There was a willingness to try to embrace a much more inclusive conception of Sudan that included not only people in Khartoum, but also people who lived in the more peripheral parts of the country, whether Darfur or the Nuba Mountains or Kordofan or others. And a recurring kind of theme in interviews with activists who participated was the ways in which their consciousness of what it meant to be Sudanese itself was transformed by their participation in the protest, most explicitly in sort of pushing back against the official narrative that really positions Sudan as an Arab state, an Arab and Muslim state, rather than a multi-religious, multiracial society that it actually is. All right, finally, the case of Congo is the one that I've been following the most closely. So I just want to say a few things about this because I think it's super interesting. So this is a movement that emerged around the elections in 2016 called Lucha. This was one of the founders, Luke Nkulula, who was eventually killed by the government. Mostly a middle-class movement that emerged in Goma and was initially focused very much on the Congolese elections. Over time, it morphed pretty dramatically in a variety of ways. So even as they kind of had a lot of success in pushing the Kabila regime to eventually hold elections, they started to take on additional tasks, which made them even more popular and more of a threat to the regime, hence the reasons why they started to face such harsh crackdowns. But what I think is really interesting, because I want to wrap up, is the way in which their agenda has shifted over time. So to come back to kind of the role of contingency in shaping the evolution of social movements. One of the most interesting things with Lucha is that their activism really originated around electoral malfeasance, but eventually has evolved to start to take on kind of the larger social, political, and economic context that has shaped Eastern Congo for the past 20, 25 years. And so one of the types of protests that they've been engaged in has been against the United Nations presence in Eastern Congo. Right. And these were a series of protests that Lucha organized against MONUSCO. MONUSCO is the United Nations Stabilization Mission in Congo. It's the largest UN peacekeeping mission in the world. It draws something like $1.4 billion annually. It's a huge, massive mission that's been in the region for over 2 decades. And what's really interesting about these protests is that the UN, by and large, does not even acknowledge the issues that Lucha is raising. Right? Lucha has been very consistent that their protests are not only against the government of Congo, but also against the presence of MONUSCO altogether, because they view it as fundamentally detrimental. And what they have done is really work to sort of push beyond the kind of middle-class student base that formed the core of the movement in its initial days, and to try to reach out to rural village populations to help them understand their, what I would consider a tripartite critique, a critique against the government of Congo, a critique against the violent militias that operate in the Eastern region, and a critique of the international community vis-a-vis MONUSCO. And I think this is hugely important because a lot of how we think about radicalism in Africa is shaped by the international discourse around politics in Africa, right? So that there is a way in which much of the discourse around humanitarianism emphasizes what Agamben refers to as bare life, right? The need to keep people alive by providing them the very basics, protection, shelter, and maybe food, right? And what you see with Lucha in particular and other movements that I'm interested in is that they're trying to push beyond such a narrow conception of the possibilities of politics in the African space, right? Rather than reducing it, as Micheline says here, Micheline is one of the founders of Lucha, to eating and sleeping, there's a demand for a voice for ordinary Africans in their political and economic life. And that to me is the core of the potential of what these movements represent, a movement beyond kind of electoralism that has defined African democracy thus far, and a call for a centering of African humanity within African political and economic life. Here, just a very explicit demand from another founder of one of the leaders of Lucha, around MONUSCO, right? What's very interesting about these protests is that I read interviews with MONUSCO leaders, and they basically were dismissing the protesters as ignorant and backward and naive, and not understanding that the UN was there to help. Right? In response to that, Lucha is very explicit in saying, look, we're not just protesting against the UN because you guys are the rich people in this space. We're protesting against you because we believe that your politics and your intervention in this space is harmful. And so they made it very explicit in their demands that MONUSCO actually leave altogether, that the MONUSCO not continue to allow the Congolese government to operate with impunity in the eastern part of the country, and that if you got rid of MONUSCO altogether, then potentially you're opening up the political space to other types of political actors who can do what they really want, which is to hold the government accountable for the welfare of the population, rather than having the international community come in and apply band-aids to these chronic issues. Let me leave it at that because I want to keep time for questions. So I'll wrap it up here, and I look forward to hearing your thoughts. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Zachariah. I think that Idalina, you have the phone. We cannot hear you.
Yeah, now thank you so much, Zachariah, for continuing to push the goalposts of the discussion on popular protests in Africa. So thank you so much and for the emphasis on rural protests. And in fact, I think this is really a promising line of research. So thank you so much for that. I will now open the discussion to the participants. So you're welcome to pose your questions, comments, reflections. You can raise your hands or just write the questions in the chat.
So maybe if nobody starts, I have just a few comments and one question, but I don't want to abuse my role, our role. Yes. I will be just super quick, and it's also a field that for me is really new because, as you mentioned, we are very well, or a bit. I don't know if it's we are not so familiar, and it's really harmful with social movements in. Particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, because a lot of studies were developed on Arab Spring, etc. But and I think that here, thanks also to colleagues of African studies working on African studies from very different perspectives. I'm very happy that I can get more familiar with what's happening, and very interesting things were actually occurring in the past years, also in Portuguese-speaking Africa, in Mozambique. So I think that is a very big issue, and we really need to know more. And so rich of things happening. That is. So thank you very much for your talk. I really like it. And just very quick questions and reflections. So when you mentioned this. You started your reflection around the relation between rural and urban axis of potential axis of protest, and the fact that rural has traditionally be considered not a good space for social mobilization, like because of I just wanted to ask you if this wasn't different during the 60s and the 70s because of the anti-colonial movements and also the Maoist influences, so this valorization of the rural as main actors of the revolution, the potential very important actors of the revolution. Another point related to the rural is well, I think that here in Europe, we also are a little bit too much focused on what's happening in the cities. Sometimes we forget to look at around, and for sure there are things happening, and the lens of social movements, sometimes they are not able to capture what's happening, the lens of social movement studies. But what you were saying, I have some students working on Brazil, and she's here, Lara, and particularly to Movimento Sem Terra, well, rural movements in Brazil, and this relation with environmental issues. This is also very interesting for me. That is something that maybe here in Europe is not so simple because also of the big industrialization of agriculture, maybe. So we have a rural space that is an industrial space. So maybe the conflict is also very different in this sense. And finally, sorry if I have many questions, but I will be just finishing. If this urgence of and weight of very important issues related to basic political freedoms and rights and economic rights also is maybe preventing room for for other issues more linked to the environment exactly, or the gender issues, and so what's the balance? I don't want to talk about these issues and claim as post-material, because I'm sure that any question related to gender, environment, gentrification, etc., they have a lot of material components, so they are not post-material in my view. But what's the room for this? And I finish here.
Okay, thank you so much, Guia, for the comments and questions. Zachariah, would you like to answer these questions or just collect a few more?
We can collect more. I see Stuart has his hand up. So.
Okay, go ahead, Stuart.
And I think Lara also want to say something after.
Yeah, okay.
Or no, Anna, I don't know. No,
Anna,
I will.
Anna, it's Anna. So,
I think I was wrong, sorry.
That's fine. Stuart?
So Stuart.
Okay, thank you. Could you, yeah, we're not listening. You have to activate the sound. Okay, I'm not.
Is it because we don't allow?
Yeah, now it's there. Okay.
Okay.
Yeah. Good. Sorry. It said that I was not allowed to deactivate.
Sorry, there was some. So I'm very sorry. I think that Lara also was doing some kind of showing me this. Yeah. No.
And also the chat. It doesn't let me type in the chat. I was going to type it in the chat. Just make quickly question. I'm from humanitarian sector. So there's a lot of discussion now in the humanitarian sector about localization. And my question is, how should we localize? I'm slightly concerned that if we localize by empowering NGOs, that we might be empowering non-democratic structures if we go in that direction. Is there a good way to localize? And what should we do as humanitarians, as international humanitarians, to encourage local democratic structures and handing over this power that we have when we are working in the aid sector? Thank you.
Thank you, Stuart. Now, Ana Lucia. Could you please authorize the sound for the participants and the chat as well? I think it's not.
Oh, the chat they can.
Yeah, I think we can. Hello, good afternoon. And Lara wanted to talk first, so
okay.
I think
Okay, Ana Lucia, go ahead and then.
Okay. So thank you. Good afternoon, and thank you so much for your presentation. And as other people said, I'm also a fan of your work, and I read with great enthusiasm your Africa Uprising. I have a bad internet connection, so if my questions cannot be heard properly, please let me know. I have some doubts more than
We lost Anna.
in this new framework. I'm here. This is because I'm at university and my internet connection is unstable. I'm sorry. My question was about the concept of rural. How can we define rural? And are we talking about?
Oh, that's a shame.
I will write in the chat.
Okay.
Anna, try to turn off the video. And I think just for the question.
No, because I have other. Maybe you can allow me to write in the chat.
Sure.
Please, because if not, it's better. Okay, so what is the rural? It's small cities outside the capital, resource exploring areas as diamond areas in the Congo, or oil exploring areas. What are we talking about when we talk about rural? And you mentioned really briefly, you had this question if Africa is too poor and is too rural and too ethnic, and ethnicity disappeared as your variable in the presentation. I don't know, I'm just curious if you are engaging, and how are you engaging with this variable, and in relation to new labor relations and identities in these rural areas. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Zachariah, should we continue, or maybe we?
Yeah, let me take these questions and we'll have another round.
I'm sorry, can I just add something like this? Actually have something to do with Goya and Ana Lucia just said, and maybe can get together with this. Sure. No, I was just going to ask also about ethnicity, that Ana Lucia just came up with these, and add this to what Goya was asking about environmental issues attached to these rural movements, because I don't know, I think sometimes ethnicity is said in a pejorative way in some like Occidental frameworks to analyze social movements. But what I've been seeing in Brazil is also like a kind of a revitalizing of these ethnicity as a political flag to these social movements. So I also would like to know that I know actually very little about rural social movements in Africa. And so it was just to also get to know about this point in this context too. And thank you very much for the presentation. It was very, very interesting.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lara. Now, Zachariah.
Sure. Okay, so let me try to take some of these questions. Really interesting questions. You know, obviously things I'm still thinking through as the project evolves. But let me see some initial thoughts. So the first question on, you know, how do the 1960s, 70s protests relate to what's happening today? I think that's a hugely important one. Obviously, 1960s and 70s Africa was far more rural than it is today. You know, some African countries have said like 80% of the population living in rural areas. That was the default for most of Africa until fairly recently, when we've seen these huge increases in urbanization. And why is this important? Well, it's because almost all of the successful nationalist movements that unfolded in this period had very, very strong ties to the rural spaces. Either they were like literally based in the rural areas, or the vast majority of their supporters were drawn from rural spaces, right? And so the rural was very much at the center of varying forms of African resistance. And it's interesting to see how much it has been displaced in the contemporary conversation. So why did that happen? Right? How did the rural really lose significance? And I think here, and this is really speculation, but I think that, you know, there was this period in the early 1990s with the collapse of the Soviet Union. So the other side of the huge spike in popular urban protests in the 1990s during the second wave was this huge spike in rural violence in Africa. Right, and you can see this very clearly in data that comes from this period. You know, Africa goes through this huge spike in violence in the late 80s and the early 1990s that is predominantly unfolding in the rural areas, right? And so the logic of rural politics starts to shift I would suggest, during this period, from one in which, the rural population is this vast reservoir that can be mobilized by urban political elites, to the conception that the rural area is fundamentally this space of atavistic violence, of tribal violence, right? And there's a very, I think, important and influential piece written during this period by Thandika Mkandawire, where he basically says, that in Africa today, conflicts are over, conflicts in Africa today are not about the agrarian question, they are about the urban question, right? And that the rural areas have basically just become spaces where, political elites who are concerned with capturing power at the center might march through and destroy on their way to capturing power in the center, but are fundamentally not reflecting political questions emerging out of the rural areas themselves. Right? And so the rural then goes on to become almost the site of permanent crisis. Right? It is the site of these warlords, these militias, these ethnic tribal groupings, and that fundamentally that is the limit of the political potential of the rural areas. Right? That political conflicts, by definition, are taking place in the urban spaces. Right? And I think now what we're seeing is that narrative was probably never true, right? And if that logic did seem to reflect African realities, that it no longer holds. Right? So that's really what I'm interested in, because I come out of that period. Like, my first book is on political violence, on violent movements. I got my PhD in the early 2000s, and so it was a time in which all of us were really obsessed with the urban political struggles, right? And we sort of had this assumption that the rural was irrelevant, and I'm now questioning whether that ever was an accurate depiction of what was unfolding. On the question of post-material identities versus these sorts of uprisings, I think that's kind of the core tension that we are trying to trace in this distinction we draw between political and civil society protests, right? You raise the question of movements for gender rights, right? And I would distinguish those in Africa today from women's participation in popular movements. Right? So in Sudan, you had a lot of women who were at the forefront of the Sudanese Uprising. Did they consider themselves to be participating also in a feminist movement? And that's a really interesting debate, and I've seen a lot of Sudanese feminist scholars try to take it up, because fundamentally it doesn't seem that the ordinary women who were participating in the uprising actually agreed with the analysis of how they were portrayed internationally. Right. So you may remember the image of the female Sudanese protester, which became kind of iconic of the Sudanese uprising itself, and was positioned as a sort of feminist interpretation of the uprising. But I think, on the ground, that's not how it was experienced. Right. Women were at the forefront of those protests, but they were very much divorced from kind of the formalized African feminist movement. I mean, there's a robust African feminist movement that is very much based in the urban areas, is populated by, say, middle-class, educated African women. Really interesting stuff. I don't want to diminish them at all, right? But to suggest that they were at the forefront of those protests is problematic, right? Because that erases the participation, especially of working-class African women who were participating in the protests as part of a popular uprising, and not as explicitly protests in the interests of African women. Right? I think there are some exceptions to this, right? Obviously, the End SARS protests in Nigeria did have a lot of involvement of the formalized middle-class African feminist sector. But again, I think there's this disconnect between kind of civil society's interpretation of these events and attempts to center certain types of political actors in tune with kind of international or national trends, and the reality of how kind of ordinary people who are participating in these protests conceptualize their involvement. Right. And I don't have a resolution to that, but I think it's something that we need to take seriously in terms of how we understand this. Let me move on to Ana Lucia's question about how I define the rural. I mean, this was a real challenge for me, I think, initially, right? Because I too had bought into this narrative of a clearly defined urban space and a clearly defined rural space. Again, going back to Mkandawire, whose work I love. I think he's amazing. But I think he also fell victim to this strict binary between the rural and urban, which characterizes almost a lot of our studies. And I think, in the context of writing Africa Uprising, one of our core theoretical contributions was really taking seriously this category of political society and trying to apply it to the African context, right? And there I sort of struck upon this idea, which I'm trying to now develop further, to push back against this idea of a strict binary between urban and rural, right? If you study African politics, this is perhaps the founding divide of African political analyses, right? You could look at Fanon, you could look at Mamdani, right? And they always talk about the compartmentalization of African life and the urban mode of governance as being fundamentally distinct than the rural mode of governance. And I think that's really useful because it's very helpful in illuminating a kind of stylized interpretation of the differences between rural politics and urban politics. Right? Even if it often wasn't convincing empirically, right? And that's, I think, something that we need to push back against, to move beyond a kind of binary thinking, but instead foreground how both the urban and rural are mutually constituted, right? And that's what I found in the work of people like Sam Moyo, where he was always really emphasizing kind of the interrelated construction of African urban and rural spaces, right? His insistence that we understand urbanization not as unidirectional, as rather this process of circular migration, right? And that inevitably, when you have circular migration patterns, that you will transform both the urban and the rural, right, has been much more useful to me. And so now what I'm interested in not is like, here's a geographic space that we can call the rural, and here's a geographic space that we can call the urban, but rather, how does the rural as an idea manifest in urban spaces? How does the rural transform urban spaces, and how does and vice versa? How does the urban shape the rural, right? And so that's what I'm trying to move towards, is to push past kind of a binary thinking of urban-rural, but rather rural and urban as representing different poles of these larger national and international questions, right? So how they're all interrelated and mutually constructed. And I guess finally, with the Lara's question on issues of the environment, I think this is super interesting and important, right? Because again, think about how if you say African environmental movements, right? What do you think about? And perhaps the most prominent African environmental activist is someone like Wangari Maathai in Kenya, or Vanessa Nakate in Uganda, who is positioned as Africa's Greta Thunberg, right? And who came to prominence by participating in the Fridays for the Future protests. And these are fundamentally urban movements. Maathai was based in Nairobi. Her project was to plant trees in Nairobi and the surrounding areas. Nakate's project, in as much as she has a project, which is hard to discern, is very much like, we want to mobilize, middle-class Ugandan youth to care about environmental change, right? And that's interesting, but I think it's a real failure on behalf of the international community to pay attention to the actual sites, right, of climate change in the African context, and the actual drivers of climate change in the African context. And what I would suggest is that those are fundamentally rural spaces, right? And rather than rural spaces being kind of detached, the global climate change movement has completely failed to try to figure out how to even engage with these movements. So when I think about the anti-gas pipeline protests in southern Tanzania, that should have been a cause célèbre for the global environmental movement, right? Instead, they received no support, no attention. I arrived there, it would be a month after the protests happened, because I was living in Dar es Salaam at the time, and everybody there thought that I was a representative of the international community. They thought I was from the UN. They thought I was from the international media. They thought I was from the US government, right? Because they assumed that what they were doing mattered. And I had to tell them over and over, no, I'm just an academic. I'm just trying to figure out what's happening here, because I saw some really bad coverage of this in the newspapers, and nobody seems to be talking about this at all. Right? And I thought, eventually this would come out and people would be like, oh, look, Tanzanians are protesting fossil fuels. I mean, isn't this amazing? And there was none of that, right? No coverage. My colleague, Adam Branch, who I wrote Africa Uprising with, has been doing this long-term project on the charcoal industry in northern Uganda, right? If you want to understand climate change in Uganda, you don't need to look to middle-class students in Kampala. You need to look at the role of the UPDF, the Ugandan military, in the charcoal trade in northern Uganda, right? Because charcoal is the predominant fuel that Ugandans continue to use, and it is being extracted at a tremendous cost to the environment across all of Africa, right? But especially in Uganda, where the military is massively involved in not only the Ugandan charcoal trade, but also the Sudanese charcoal trades. Right? And it is leading to, I mean, extreme forms of deforestation in these areas, and it is being challenged by local civil society activists, academics, and others, with, again, zero attention from the global environmental movement, right? Who much prefer to foreground, say, middle-class activism taking place in African cities, which then leads to the false narrative, right, that Africans are not particularly active around climate change. And so, you know, again, I think by sort of shifting our lens to take seriously what's happening in these rural spaces, it illuminates a whole variety of issues that have thus far been ignored. Right? Let me stop there because I see a couple other hands and I want to make sure I can try to address those concerns in our last few minutes.
Yeah, thank you, Zachariah. If you could bear with us just a few minutes more, let me just ask Andrea Marina to pose this question. If you could activate this sound.
Okay.
You can do it? Okay.
Can you hear me? Okay. Okay, thank you for your presentation. I have two really brief questions. One of the first of them being, could you I don't know how to put this, but I was thinking of like the border zones in African countries, or also the rural urban divide that you were talking during your talk, and I was thinking that could it be that those protests emerge not only on those physical fringes of the state, but also on those symbolic spaces of the state, like the border zones or the rural areas, like the shanty towns you were also referring. And I was thinking on the concepts of the infrastructural power of the state, those zones being the less integrated zones of political power. And perhaps the rule could work as a freer space for movements to emerge. I was thinking on that possibility. I don't know, what are your thoughts on that? The second of those of my questions would be, and building on Lara's comment and on her work on the landless people's movement in Brazil, I was also thinking about the landless people movement in Namibia and the questions of land distribution. And I would like to hear your thoughts on that, about the relationship between social movements and party politics and the political system, and how those questions could be also important today for social movements also to dialogue and to broaden their claims with other social movements, as movements on climate change or environmental issues. Thank you.
Thank you, Andre. Anyone else wants to join in? And so this is the last call.
Can I?
And Tiago, força.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Zachariah, for the very interesting talk. As Guya was saying, you know, sometimes we are not so much aware of what's going on in Africa, and this was really, really informative. I had a lot of questions actually, but some of them you already pointed to the answer. But I have just a very brief question. So you talked about how in the border between the urban and the rural and slums and so on, that you have these not formal kind of civil society existing, that, and I thought that was really interesting. And that brought to mind some of the findings that we had in Southern Europe during the anti-austerity protests and the anti-austerity cycle protest, where when the welfare state retrenched, in countries like Greece, for instance, you had a lot of social movements coming in and filling in for a lot of the services like healthcare, education, food, providing those services. Do social movements, it's only about protests, or do they also do other stuff beyond protests as well? Do they, do community organizing and so on? And the other question is like inverting normally in social movement studies, we always see social movement becoming parties, but if we invert that relation, do you have parties protesting in Africa as well? So those are my questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Anyone else? One final question? No? Okay, Zachariah, let me just join one or two questions as well. So one of the things that really interested me in your presentation was how you were trying to link different processes. So on the one hand, this argument on the role of traditional leaders is really interesting and compelling and really promising. And I see that because traditional authorities are being incorporated in the state in countries like Zambia and Mozambique, and this perhaps attenuated their role as local brokers. So they became something different. So local populations might actually have lost their connection, or perhaps someone that would argue in their favor. So perhaps this process of decentralization might have generated a power vacuum to the incorporation of traditional leaders in the state. So this is really interesting, and I wanted to ask whether you could elaborate a bit more on that. And finally, do you think that the urbanization and circular migration will actually dilute some of the distinctions that you were trying to establish between protests in rural areas? Do you expect some kind of contagion, either of the kind of tools, the kind of frames, connections? Will that happen in the future? I know that you are just trying to map rural movements now, but that's just a way of trying to push your arguments further. Thank you so much. So feel free to address whatever questions you want, because I just know that we are now a bit over time.
I'll be very quick. I mean, these are super interesting questions, and each one deserves a lot more than I'll say. But I'm happy to continue this conversation in other spaces. First, I think to Andre's question around the sort of borders and the transnational context in which these movements are unfolding. One thing I'd point to is historically the rural has always been the site of modernist fantasies, right? Of experimentation around the meaning of the state. And so whether we're talking about development or security, national governments across Africa have often assumed that they have a right and a need, in fact, to transform rural sites with almost no input from the rural communities themselves, right? So we can look at Ujamaa in Tanzania, we can look at the building of dams, Aswan Dam in Egypt, we can look at the Volta Dam in Congo, I mean in Ghana, like the current dams in Eastern Congo. I mean, repeatedly, right? Whether we're talking about national governments or the international community, there's been an assumption that the most massive dislocations and projects that are going to unfold should take place in the rural spaces. Right? And there's an obvious reason for this, because historically it was assumed that you'll encounter less resistance, and it's easier to buy off traditional elites in order to facilitate these sort of massive schemes. Right? And I think that is why we need to be paying more attention to these rural spaces. So my error in the past, and I think this is true for a lot of us, is that the way that we study this is kind of the echoes in the urban spaces, right? So people who study, say, the Nubian population in Cairo, right, will limit their analysis to kind of those communities that were displaced by the construction of these dams. Right? And as they arrive into the city and are rendered into these ghettoized spaces, and that's literally the kind of the political society dynamic that we were interested in with the first book. But what we have not done enough is to try to pay attention to what's unfolding in the rural spaces themselves. So it's never like you wipe the slate clean, right? You introduce these new political and economic logics, and there's bound to be some sort of reaction, right? And I don't think we've spent enough time thinking through what those reactions look like. So maybe I can jump here to Idalida's point, right? So, one of the things that is really interesting, to give you a concrete example from Sudan, is that as a result of a lot of these agricultural schemes, which again are taking place in the Jazeera, which is a rural part of the country, you had massive internal migration from one rural area to another. And so what does this mean, right? So in some parts of Sudan, the rural populations, 60% of the residents are internal migrants. Right? Meaning they come from somewhere else. They come from outside of the traditional authority. But they're not moving into the cities, they're moving to another rural space. right? And they are no longer participating in the traditional economic sectors that chiefs used to serve as brokers in. So if you were historically, say, a migrant from one part of the rural Sudan into another part of rural Sudan, you were by definition a marginalized figure, right? Because the traditional authority could deny you access to land. That was their power. Their power was to determine who has access to the land, right? Now you're arriving into these spaces, and it's not agriculture, not subsistence agriculture that is the basis of livelihoods. It is instead agribusiness, right? These massive development projects or mining projects, there's other things. So that these migrants who are rural to rural migrants no longer need to secure employment by the mediating role of the traditional chief. And in some cases, as Elamine documents in the Sudanese case, these populations have now become the majority within these traditional authorities. Now, inevitably, this is going to create tensions, right? As the traditional authority loses their broker role, as you put it, they're going to push back, right? But fundamentally, because I have a very materialist understanding of a lot of these political dynamics, they are limited because historically their power was derived from the state. But who is it that allowed these agricultural projects to go forth in the first place? It is the state, right? It's the Sudanese government who's selling off rural lands to Saudi investors with no involvement of the traditional chiefs. This is a hugely different dynamic, right? And so all of a sudden, the chief is left bereft. Now, how we feel about that is, some people may bemoan the loss of these traditional ways of life, but if you come from a more critical perspective, the chiefs were always understood as decentralized despots, right? To use Mamdani's terminology, right? And in some ways, again, I don't want to apply a normative lens to this, right? Inevitably, what we're seeing is a diminishment of traditional authority, and this is hugely important because it portends a massive transformation of social relations in the rural spaces. Okay. Last thing I'll say, to Tiago's question around movement governance, right, which is how I think about it. Absolutely, right. I think that many of these movements, the ones that are the most sophisticated, so there's a whole range. I'm talking about very informalized movements, very spontaneous, that lack structure, lack organization, lack anything, to very sophisticated movements, where I'd put groups like Yanamar in Senegal or Lucha in Congo, where they have developed these entire apparatuses that do much more than just protesting, right? They are engaged in service provision. Lucha was very involved in COVID response. So, my friend Fred Bauma, who's one of the founders of COVID, he was actually going into rural areas to educate, villagers about, how to protect themselves from COVID. And that was very explicitly part of Lucha's politics in saying that, look, the Congolese government has failed to meet the needs of its civilians. We believe that that's the role of the government. We don't want the international community to step in and do that for them. And if the Congolese government is unable to do it, we don't need NGOs, we don't need international agencies. We will do it ourselves because we are a citizens movement, and that's what citizens do. Right? So you see many different examples of these groups getting more engaged in politics. Now, the question is, should they then transition from being a social movement into a political party? And this is a very contentious debate across the African space, right? Lucha and Yanamar have decided that no member who joins a political party can continue to carry the name Lucha or Yanamar. So if you want to run for office as Yanamar, you have to abandon Yanamar. Yanamar will not endorse political candidates, right? They told this to the founder of the movement. Fidel Barro wanted to run for office on a Yanamar ticket, and Yanamar said no, right? Yanamar does not involve itself in party politics. There are other cases, more prominent ones, like the EFF in South Africa, where Julius Malema has really kind of created a hybrid model where he's both a social movement who can call people out into the streets to protest various injustices as he perceives them, but is also competing in elections in the South African parliament, and clearly has aspirations to rise through the political ranks. In Uganda, Bobi Wine tried this with the People's Power movement, right, combining elements of a social movement with elements of a political party. That seemed to have failed in the Ugandan context. So I think anytime that these sort of efforts to co-opt social movements into party politics, we've seen limited success for that. Right? I think the movements that have chosen explicitly to say, look, we eschew party politics. We want to remain an autonomous force. Our goal as a social movement, our role as a social movement is not simply to be co-opted by political parties, but rather to remain autonomous forces within society. Right? This is very preliminary, but my sense is that they have been more successful in retaining their independent identities, but also their political influence within these different societies. as compared to those that have simply viewed the social movement as a vehicle for a political party. Yeah. And that's it.
Thank you.
Thank you for these excellent questions. Those are really good.
Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you, Zachariah, for being here with us today. And I really hope that maybe you can join us for a face-to-face seminar in the future when we come back to the normal life, the new normal or the post-normal, let's see. So I really hope that we can meet one day in Lisbon. And I'm sure that all our colleagues here also will be very happy to have you here. And but for now, thank you very much for being here today and for this very, very interesting talk and your answers, your time, the beautiful picture you sent to us. I have to say that the picture that we use for the flyer is a picture that Zachariah took himself in, and so is maybe you want just to explain a little bit the picture before closing, just to.
Yeah, sure. So the last thing I'll say is that image, I'll give credit to Anna Taban, which is a movement in South Sudan that has tried to get off the ground, hasn't been very successful because it's a very constrained political environment. But I have an essay about South Sudanese politics. I'm happy to share it.
And you said that you have many pictures you collected during these years. Have you ever think about having an exhibition? Because I think it would be very rich, contentious.
I'll put it on my list. I would love to, but I haven't done anything yet.
Yeah. Well, let's think about maybe in the future we can have here, maybe, I don't know. Let's see. But I think it was very interesting, and thank you to you, and thank to all the people that were in the audience and for your questions time. And we have the next seminar will be on the 7th of July. The title will be The Infrastructures of Support, Taste of the Right to Housing in Practice, and it will still be an online session, and but we will have an extra session in July, late July. Correct me, Tiago, if I'm on the. We still need to
mid-July 21st, if I'm not wrong. 21st? I'm not sure Carmen is still around, but
yeah, but we will inform you with more details about this later when we have everything set. So thank you very much. Tomorrow here is holiday, so enjoy the holiday. If not, I mean, in the country you're living, well, enjoy the last part of the week, working week, and keep in touch. See you soon. Take care.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you very much.
Obrigada, Gui e Tiago, beijinho.
E obrigado a ti também, não é?
Sobretudo, obrigada a ti.
Beijinho.
Tchau, beijinhos.
Obrigada.